And my father was the town doctor, so he used to have to make house calls at 3 o'clock in the morning anytime anybody had a sniffle. So he said his midlife crisis was to move to California to just get away from that whole thing, which sounds kind of crazy.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me hand this over to you, Jennifer. And I'm going to make you host.
Okay.
All right.
I feel so empowered.
Oh, you've got it now.
I've got the controls. Okay. Should I wait for a couple more people or just?
Maybe another minute or two, but I wouldn't go
Okay.
much longer. So I know there's a number of folks out there with links. Hopefully they can jump on at some point.
Yeah. Does anybody have the people that are here? Do you have any live questions? I do have some written questions here I'll get to, but if you have anything that you've thought of before you turned in your questions, I can start rambling.
Yeah, feel free, please. Any questions you may have?
Don't be shy, because once I get rambling, I could go in any direction and often do. And I'm fully caffeinated, so you might have
Oh,
to
yeah.
put a crowbar in there to get a word in. Kisa, what an interesting name. I like that. Kisa Cassandra, this is super exotic. Lucas, Peter.
This is Cassie.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
So how
Sam
are you all
joined.
on this
Awesome.
fine Saturday? I guess it's afternoon for you. You know, I got so screwed up the other day. I was just telling them I flew in to Phoenix from Portland, and I had to leave the house at 4 in the morning to get to the airport. And I had only had 2 hours sleep and slept a little bit on the plane, and I was pretty spacey. And I got this new Apple Watch that I'm not used to, and I didn't have it set for the proper time. So one of the reasons I got it is so that I don't go overtime when I'm doing music sets, because it can be super critical. Some gigs, you must stop at this time, and announcements are made for giveaways or whatever. And so that's the reason I got it, but it totally screwed me up. And it was in the wrong time zone, and I thought I thought I had another half hour to fill, and it was messing me up because I do a film show, and I know the timing of every song. So it's not like the song is going to drag out with extra improv or anything. And I was just so confused looking at my watch that I kept telling stories. And it turns out in the end, which I realized about a half hour after I was done, that I went 15 minutes too long. Just shoot me. I'm usually not that much of an airhead, but I certainly have been known to be. No questions, don't be shy. You know what? Tell me about yourselves for a couple minutes. Like Kisa, are you all guitar players? And
I'm a guitar player in my bedroom, usually by myself, but I've been playing on and off for 20 years, probably taking it more seriously like the last 5.
great. Well, honestly, I was a closet player for many, many years. I started when I was 8 years old, and I never did a paid gig until I was 21, after I had graduated from Musicians Institute, which at that time was the Guitar Institute of Technology, and it was only guitar. No, we had to hire drummers and bass players to join us at that point. It was the third class they ever had back in the olden times before they made shoes. So, yeah, it's. I remember my first gig. I made $12.50, and now here's something interesting. It was insightful doing that gig because at that time I wanted to be a jazz player, and I was reading tunes out of the what they call the real book. If you're not familiar with that, it's like a couple hundred pages of jazz standards. And I had another guitar buddy, and I would go to his house, and we would go through these songs for hours, and we finally made up a set list and booked this gig. All of a sudden, when I had an audience, I was so hyper aware of how boring it must look to look at two people staring at paper. So after that, I started memorizing tunes, so it'd be a little bit higher level of entertainment and engagement. And then fast forward to the Michael Jackson gig. People ask what I got out of that gig and what I got out of the Jeff Beck gig. And one of the main things I got out of the Michael Jackson gig was the need and the power for entertainment beyond the music. I mean, that guy, the Bad Tour, he had $1 million budget just for clothing, if you can imagine. It was probably the most expensive tour on the history of Earth. And even having said that, he made $100 million profit because everywhere he went, there was 50,000 people or more. He would sell out everywhere. And in fact, in London, he sold out Wembley Stadium, which held 80,000 people for 5 or 6 nights in a row. And, you know, most bands are lucky to sell out one night if they're really popular. So, you know, not that I have the Michael Jackson thing happening. I don't sing, I don't dance, but I'm hyper aware of the audience is watching you. And a lot of bands, I've been out to see some local bands in Portland where I live, and I know these people, some of the band members just don't have that awareness that people are watching them at all times. At all times, somebody is watching you. So it's really important to not be looking at your shoes all night. And that's easy to say, but if you're shy, and I did this when I first got on stage, I'd be looking at my shoes, and I must have been so boring to look at. The bass player used to call me coat rack to maniac because certain songs, certain grooves, I'd start dancing like a maniac. But the rest of them, people could just hang a coat on me, and it, you know, it's kind of part of the furniture. But with Michael, the bottom layer was the music. That was just the layer that he started with. And then his imagination was incredible in every sense. He always had original things exploding out of his mind. And I used to say he was a creative tornado. You see some acts out there and they'll have a choreographer that'll show them dance moves and maybe people that specialize in videos doing the videos. But Michael was hands-on on everything, every aspect of the shows. In fact, I'm good friends with his makeup artist that was the one that did the Thriller cover, Karen Fay. And she said he'd be sitting in the makeup chair and writing down lyrics as they came to him. So he had a vision for the videos, the dance, the staging. And honestly, it's kind of funny because probably most of you only know me from Michael Jackson. Maybe some know me from Jeff Beck, but if you've seen videos of me on TV, I look like Miss Confidence. And I'll tell you, that's not how I started out when I walked in the door and got hired. There was a choreographer, Vince Patterson, who's the guy that, he did the choreography for Beat It, and I think Smooth Criminal, and a couple of the big Michael things. And he brought me out of my shell. It's almost like he gave me permission to be a monster on stage. And another thing I remember is during rehearsals when I would go out front and play Beat It, which I had played in a cover band for several years before I got the gig with the real guy with the glove. I would go out front and I'd be grinning like I'm having the time of my life. I'm on the biggest tour in the world and I'm making more money than my doctor father right now, you know? And Michael's the one that said, don't smile. This song is Beat It. It's supposed to be tough. It's supposed to be badass. So he gave me instructions to snarl, you know? So when you see the videos, you see somebody that looks mean, and so people are kind of intimidated when they meet me for the first time because they think I'm this monster. But I was just doing my job, really. Let's see. So fast forward a little bit about the entertainment value. I played with Michael for 10 years. I did 3 tours: the Bad Tour, the Dangerous Tour, and the History Tour. And those were all of his solo tours without his brothers, much to his mother's not liking, because she wanted all the brothers to go out together, being a mother. And I think he'd had enough of his brothers at one point and wanted full control and wanted to do all of his songs because, I mean, Thriller was such a big hit, 40 million records. And when he sold 20 million records of that, all of the offices of Sony around the world went to Hawaii for 2 weeks because there was that much money pouring in. It was just crazy. And then it doubled up to 40 million, and God knows what it is now. So, I did Michael for 10 years and then Jeff Beck for 3 years. And after that, I thought, God, okay, what's next? That's my bucket list, and I'm not dead yet. So I started thinking about taking my own band on the road. And it just made me really
Hey, Gary.
nervous to think of having to look after
Okay,
people.
thanks, Gary. Bye.
Breaker, good buddy. Who's coming in? We got some live mics on board here. So I came up with the idea of doing a solo film show. So I wanted to go out alone at first and just see what kind of audience I could get on my own. And I reached out to film schools and anybody related to film to try to get people to make films for me. And after 1.5 years of trying, I only had 4 films, which makes for a very short 20-minute show. So one of the guys that turned in a film showed me how to do it, and then I became completely obsessed. And now I have enough film, I could probably do over a 3-hour show. It's just, that's actually more fun than music to me. It's just so addictive. I could just sit there and just, let me just do the chorus, and then I'll do something responsible, and then the chorus would be to the next verse. 10 hours later, I'm still working at it. But the whole point of that is to say that I was very aware that I needed entertainment beyond music, especially these days with people having such a short attention span from smartphones and being rewired from TikTok and Facebook. And, I read years ago that the average attention span on YouTube was 2 minutes. And then, especially during lockdown, I started making a whole bunch of videos. And like clockwork, you can see the analytics, and it's 2 minutes. And you just got to keep things happening like Cirque du Soleil. There's something to see all the time. So I really went to town. The first video that I made took me about 50 hours of gathering footage. This is 12 years ago with really slow internet. And I would download a public domain movie to be able to cut from for my videos that I play along with at midnight and just hope it was downloaded by breakfast time. That's how long it took. And, now I can get 2 gigs in a heartbeat. And if anybody's interested in the video thing, there's a resource called archive.org where you can get thousands and thousands of free videos, old movies, Shirley Temple, Felix the Cat, that sort of thing. And as long as it says public domain on it, then you're able to download it and cut it up and use it as you wish and resell it, which I did. I have a couple videos. My last CD is also a DVD. So I have some of those videos as well as the people that turned in the first videos.
Jennifer, it looks like we have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, it came in through chat.
Okay, I don't have the chat open. If you were into jazz, what led you to decide to learn a more contemporary style playing? You know what? There was an absolute moment when that happened. And after I graduated from guitar school, I would go to these jazz jams, and I wasn't very good. Some of them just totally kicked my butt. And the first time I went to one and we switched over to funk, all of a sudden I had way more fun. And all of a sudden my body was moving and I was smiling, and that was the sign, like, I need to move to a different direction. So I went from trying to be a bebop player to more jazz fusion, playing George Duke, Lee Ritenour, Larry Carlton, that kind of stuff. And I did that for a couple of years with my first band that I cut my teeth with on stage. And then we decided to go top 40 so we could get more work, basically. And over the period of 3 or so years that we were together, we did everything. So we did a lot of cover band stuff, but there was also call for the fusion stuff. And then we did a few weddings also, which are really tough, because weddings, you have 3 and 4 generations of people, and you want to start out quiet until the grandparents leave, and then kind of ramp it up as you go along, and then Hendrix comes out for the last set. So it was a really, really great experience to go through all of that. Um, so leaving jazz, it was just a combination of I wasn't great at it, and the band I was playing with wasn't either. We were just kind of hanging on for dear life. And I remember one time I got to sit in with a really great jazz band, and all of a sudden, I'll never forget how it felt. The groove was so superior to the players I was playing with. That was just one of many aha moments in my life. But honestly, I just had more fun playing funk and rock, and I just went that direction more and more. And when I ended up doing my first solo record, it's kind of all over the map. I did Giant Steps, which is a serious bebop song, but I did it as a worked out tapping uh, exercise. Really, when I really got into tapping, I wanted to be able to tap through intense chord changes. And be able to do arpeggios with four fingers. And I would take songs from the real book just to as studies to work out going through different harmonies with tapping. And one of the questions that came in before was about tapping, how I got into it. And it was parallel with Van Halen. I was in GIT, I graduated in March 79, and Van Halen was just starting to take off. I think maybe Van Halen 1 was out at that time. But I wasn't aware of him when I started. We would get a seminar from some amazing players once a month. Pat Metheny came in 1 month, Lee Ritenour, Larry Carlton, Tommy Tedesco, you name it, the studio cats that were in Hollywood. Or Pat Metheny was just happened to be playing in town, so that's how that happened. And they lost his guitar. There's a whole other story of trying to travel with your gear. So we borrowed one of the students' guitars that night. But 1 month, Emmett Chapman came, who's the guy that invented the Chapman stick instrument. The Tony Levin is the most famous one for playing it with King Crimson and Peter Gabriel. And it's 10 strings. There's 5 melody strings, 5 bass strings, and there's no picking involved. It's all tapped. And, there was 60 students in the class at that time, and 59 of us were going, yeah, that's cool, but we're just trying to get 6 strings down. Nobody's going to go out and buy this and start from scratch with a whole new instrument. But what it did was plant a seed in Steve Lynch's head. He was a classmate. If you're not familiar, he ended up in a band called Autograph. And they had a big hit called Turn Up the Radio. And were able to, actually, they opened for Van Halen for a tour. And they were able to get some success out of that. But I would check in with Steve every once in a while and see what he was up to. And it just was the most magical thing in the world because nobody was tapping back then. And people were just starting to hear about Van Halen. And I would check in with him, and he played an incredible tune at graduation. And I wrote to him, the school was in LA. After school was over, I moved back to San Diego, 100 miles south. And I wrote to him and said, can you please send me a demo cassette at that time of things you're working on? He had these worked out tapping solos. And I tried to learn what he did, and I used one finger and ended up with a blister, and it just sounded terrible. So I booked a lesson with him, and I drove to LA, and that's all it took. He explained his system, which basically I can tell you the basis of what it is. If you want to, well, you'll have a recording of this, but if you want to write it down. The easiest way to get into it is I typically go to A minor pentatonic because most people are familiar with that in the left hand. And you can copy the exact same shape. So if you're using the first finger and fourth finger in the left hand, use the first and fourth in the right hand and go up 7 frets. So what you're doing in the right hand is playing an E minor pentatonic. And all the notes in your right hand will fit in the key of A minor. I usually think of the key being in the left hand. And it's just not a mirror image, it's a parallel image. Every string, like the A string, you'd be first and third finger, first and third in the right hand. So that'll work for anything minor. Pentatonics are going to be 1,000 times easier than diatonics. Because once you get into diatonics and you got half steps, you got to look at the left hand and then the right hand, and it's just the whole thing. So I would say stay safe and unaggravated and stick with pentatonics. Now, if you're doing major sounds, instead of 7 frets apart, it'll be 5 frets apart. So for instance, if I have an A major 7 arpeggio in the left hand, starting at 7th fret, 7, 6, 5, 4, then I would have a D major 7 arpeggio in the right hand. Tap one note in the right, push off to the left, and on and on in the same diagonal shape in both hands. And that'll get you a whole lot of playing. And one of the reasons I was really intrigued with it also was I wasn't a very speedy player. And all of a sudden, when I got rid of that pick, it was like zoom. You know, I had tried to learn Flight of the Bumblebee picking, and I think that the fastest I could manage was 160 beats a minute. I ended up working out a fingering for two-hand tapping, and I was able to get up to 200 beats a minute. You don't realize how much that pick hangs you up speed-wise until you get rid of it. And mostly I still use a pick, but it's kind of a hybrid. A lot of times I'll have a pick in this hand, and I have 3 fingers left over that I can tap with. Or sometimes, sadly, I will put it in my mouth. And, you know, now that COVID is happening, I'm like, oh, I cannot shake people's hands and put my hand on my pick and put the pick in my mouth. So that's, you know, I've been doing this. I've been playing since I was 8 years old, and it never occurred to me that every time I fly to Europe and get sick the second week I'm there, it's because I'm shaking people's hands and putting my hands on the pick. So let that be an enlightening moment too. Another question, what advice would you give to young female musicians? I would say there are no excuses anymore. Now is the time. People are looking for females. Back in my day, when I joined Michael Jackson's tour in 1987, it was pretty rare. Wendy and Lisa had joined Prince before I joined Michael. And, you know, I remember seeing on MTV, Billy Idol had a female keyboard player. And I thought, man, okay, now is the revolution. In fact, I'll back up. And when I went to GIT, I was the only woman there. There was 59 guys and me, which there was a huge advantage that I could play in the bathroom and get that great reverb knowing I wouldn't be bothered. So, but yeah, there are so many great young women out there playing right now. I often say there's not a month that goes by that I don't get turned on to some amazing 7-year-old female player in Indonesia that can kick my ass. You know, it's the YouTube generation, which I didn't have. I just had whatever local music store teacher was going to teach me. When I started in a store in New York, and I basically went out of the reading book, you know, learn the notes on the neck and learn Yankee Doodle and that kind of stuff. And then a year later, we moved to San Diego, and I ended up with a guy that was into finger picking, which was great because I got my right hand technique happening, and I was a blank slate, you know, teach me anything, any genre. I just wanted to learn to play guitar. And then the family moved again, and I ended up with kind of a blues guy that took me a little ways, and then a rock guy. So it was kind of good to mix and match like that. And I will tell you, I like to tell this story because it might be inspiring. You know, if you look at me and go, oh, Michael Jackson, Jeff Beck, you're just born a genius, or whatever you've conjured up in your mind. You know, I flunked the test to get into the Guitar Institute because I took those lessons for years and years, and I learned technique, I learned songs, but I did not learn any theory at all. I had my pentatonic scales down. One of the questions I was asked when I did the audition was to play a G major 7 chord. And I go, great. And I play like a cowboy first position G dominant 7. And I didn't know the difference. And so they said, you're not quite ready for the school. And they suggested a teacher in San Diego that I studied with that kicked my butt. He was totally into bebop. He had me learning Chet Baker's solos and Charlie Parker's solos and learning chord scales. And it was just a really, really intense education. And I was practicing for hours and hours a day. And 6 months later, I was able to get into the school. Um, yeah, there went an unusual pause in my monologue. So female musicians, yeah, go for it. One thing I will say is that if you end up in a situation where you don't feel welcome, leave, because it's not healthy. There are so many people that want to play music that basically, if you're in a band and not everybody has respect for each other, it's not going to be a pleasant situation, and it's going to be hard to grow. And if you're there always intimidated and walking on eggshells and afraid to make a mistake, it's just not a healthy environment to be in. When I moved to LA, let's see, I did the school. I moved back to San Diego, cut my teeth with this cover band, and went back to LA. And my father gave me a little loan to get started, and boy, did that go away quick. And my very last opportunity to make a living at music or playing live, before I had to pull the plug and get a day job, I auditioned for this cover band. And, I worked really hard at even singing songs, which, I have a story about why I don't sing anymore. I can clear a room in a heartbeat, but I thought I did a pretty good job. Anyway, I learned the snot out of the songs. I was well prepared. And afterwards, the guy said, that was really good, but we always have problems with chicks. And I thought, what a time waster. Why did you even bring me here? And I think it was a year later, I got the Michael Jackson tour, and it was just like, nanner, nanner. Not good enough for you, huh? So that was a 10-year paid vacation, really. I mean, there was plenty of time between tours where I didn't even think about him putting out another record and hiring me again, but he did 3 times. So, and I will tell you, here's a little lesson in not taking things for granted. When he announced the This Is It shows that were going to happen in London, I had flown into Heathrow and I had a long layover, and I was just having a cappuccino and watching it on TV, and I go, cha-ching! Of course he's going to call me again. He calls me for every tour. And lo and behold, at that point, he wanted a woman half my age, the son of a bitch. But that's how it goes. And I often look back, of course he passed away before those dates ever happened, when Orianthe got that gig. And I often think, boy, if I had gotten that gig, I would have spent so much money getting all new gear, and then poof, there's no money coming in. So it was really a godsend that I didn't get that. And I felt, too, because I had done it, and I was a little burnt out on Billie Jean, as you might imagine. I've played the Beat It solo more times than I care to speak of, and will be playing it for the rest of my life. Right now, for some reason, he's been gone over 10 years, I think, now. And all of a sudden, Michael Jackson tributes are in every country contacting me. So I have a tribute I do in Brazil. The Brazilians are coming. Actually, they're coming your way. Well, not as close, but we're doing New York City in the summer sometime. There's another, my first American tribute is taken off now. And I've been going to the UK. There's an impersonator that tours the UK and has been doing it for about close to 30 years. So he's got a real fan base built up. We usually do theaters of 500-600, or sometimes on weekends 1,500. So it's kind of nice, I signed up for Michael years ago, and it's still paying it forward. Let me get to these other questions, or if you have any new questions, feel free to type them in. When did I first know I wanted to be a professional career musician? I remember announcing to my mother when I was 12 years old. I remember I probably tortured her. I brought her into my room because I had written a song. It was real ethereal, and turned out the lights because I wanted the ambiance to be just so, right? It was my first performance, and it was probably awful. But I told her at that point that I wanted to be a professional musician. And the only reason I remember that is she had a little pushback. She goes, "Now, honey, that's a very competitive business." And, that's a very motherly thing to say, but it kind of really made me question what I had announced. And every once in a while, it is not an easy business, you know. A lot of people, of course, you look at Van Halen and go, I want to be there. I want to be at that level, have a band, write songs, and have millions of dollars coming in. But that's the 1%. And the rest of us make a living in other ways. And especially now that there's hardly any money coming from Spotify and all that, and people can get your music for free, which I will give Jim a link so you can have all my music for free. Because I had planned to play today, but then after we booked this, I got this gig in Arizona, so I'm at somebody's house, and it's a whole thing to set up the amplifier. So you can have all my records instead.
Jennifer, another question came in.
Yeah. So I was 12 when I announced I want to be a professional musician, and I remember in high school that they had a list of things that you could possibly be, and at that point I put forest ranger, but I eventually came back to music, obviously. I've seen on some YouTube ads that claim the pentatonic scales are a hindrance to learning how to solo on guitar. What's your opinion on that? And is there a particular scale that you find particularly useful? The competition for lessons on YouTube is really fierce. And it's gotten, it's like used car salesmen, a lot of them. I've seen ads that say, don't learn scales, do it my way. In fact, Carol Kay says she doesn't use scales, which is total crap, because you can't play music without scales. The most important tones are going to be the chord tones. So that's one thing I remember from going to GIT years ago, is Don Mock said, when you're playing over changes, the arpeggio tones should light up in your mind as like bright red. Scale tones could be more of a dull orange, and just the wrong notes should just be black. Like you don't even see them in your consciousness. And then same thing with the next chord that you go to. So the ideal notes are going to be the chord tones. I don't agree with any of that. So many people claim this and that, and I think it's just like if you're gonna build a house, you want to have a hammer and a drill and some nails and some screws and everything else that you need. Those are your tools, and to leave any of the tools out is going to be a hindrance. I think you need to learn everything, but don't be overwhelmed with it. Learning things in small chunks where you can have little wins is really important. It's really important because it's really easy to compare yourself to other people. Like Alan Holdsworth, it's some monster like that. And to get depressed because you don't think you'll ever be that is really the wrong way to go. And I have to do this myself. I think everybody does it to a degree. You see a monster player and just go, I can't do that, But look at yourself and go, what can you do? And the whole reason we want to play music is to express ourselves, be original, hopefully, and experience joy, the joy of communication. And I know for me, I've been playing for many, many decades, and it always feels good when somebody says, you sounded great tonight. And it's almost like you feed off of that. But if you feel you didn't have a good show, it's kind of lesser. But there was one point where, I don't know, not that many years ago, I started, instead of people saying it sounded good, they would say it was inspiring. And that means more to me than anything, because I know how I feel when I get inspired. That's why I go to shows. Probably back in the day when I was a music student, I'd be arms crossed like, what can you do? And I've had students come into my classes like that, like, what can you teach me? But, if you can get beyond all that drama and just get into the joy of music and what you can create, that's what keeps you fired up and should always. And if anybody ever gets depressed, well, whether you get depressed or not, I highly, highly recommend a book called The Artist's Way. It's by Julia Cameron, and when I got turned on to it, it was kind of an underground hit that people would share, and I would buy 10 copies at a time and turn everybody onto it. This woman is like the supreme psychologist for all creative people. She knows the thoughts we have. She knows the negative thoughts that come across and the insecurity and on and on and on. And it's designed like a workbook where you read a chapter, there's inspiring quotes on the side, and then you do this work at the end of it. And I was so intrigued, I read the whole book and then went back and started reading it again. And it's something, it's like every couple of years I need to go back and remind myself of why I'm here, what am I doing, and why. It's super, super helpful. So especially for students, because even in your own class, if you got monster players and you're intimidated by them, it could knock you into another path entirely because you're depressed that you're not this person. But if you always bring it back to you are who you are and you've got something to say, and it might not be for 5-10 years that you feel you have an original voice. I remember specifically, Pat Metheny was pretty new on the scene when I was at the school. And I remember looking at all these different guitar players, like Robin Ford, Van Halen was hitting, Lee Ritenour, Larry Carlton. And I remember reaching the conclusion that there are no more sounds. Like every great guitar sound has been taken. Pat Metheny has his slippy slidey sound. Robin Ford has his sound. And of course it's absurd because it's, guitar playing especially, I think it's one of the supreme instruments because there's so many ways to personalize it. Every note you play, like if you have a 24 fret guitar, for instance, you can play the open E string, you can play E on the B string, you can play E on every string, and they all sound completely different. So whether you realize it or not, you're making choices about how hard you're picking, where you're picking. Are you picking close to the neck or close to the bridge, somewhere in between? It all sounds different. What pickup are you choosing? And I think one of the questions was what was my favorite guitar player is Jeff Beck, and has been since I was about 14. And the fact that I got to play with him was just remarkable. And I had learned all of his solos on the Blow by Blow record and the Wired record long before I got in his band. And that was like going to school. He invented a lot of the sounds that we take for granted today, the wicked harmonics that are in between the frets. And I mean, I think one of the reasons I admire him so much is he's got such an identifiable voice, and it's so original that he's one of those guys that you know who it is in 4 bars. Or maybe for me, probably one note, depending on what the tune is. Having said that, I immediately think back to a rockabilly record that he did where he was pretty much copying Cliff Gallup, which was an early childhood hero of his from the Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps band. And you really can't tell it's Jeff from that because he's trying to be somebody else. But every other Jeff Beck record is so expressive, especially the ballads. And in fact, when I have students, I try to get them to learn 2 solos because there's so much education in each one. The song "'Cause We Ended as Lovers" that Stevie Wonder wrote, and they're both instrumentals, and "Goodbye Pork Pie Hat." And you play along with those, and it's impossible not to feel what he's feeling. And you start to build a catalog of nuance. And I think that's the most important thing in music. You can take an acoustic piano player, and you can have 10 people play the same chunk of music. And if you're blindfolded, you're not going to hear a lot of difference. The only nuance is maybe how long you stay on a note, how hard you hit the key, maybe if you use the sustain pedal. But if you have 10 guitar players, it's going to be a world of different sound because there are so many nuanced choices. Or how fast is your vibrato? How far are you bending? And on that note, I'll say I'm super old now. Don't tell anybody. But because of it, I've had a little arthritis problems. And I've gone from pretty heavy strings down to eights, which are just kind of like playing hair. But I've gotten used to it, and it's so much easier to not only bend strings, but to do little quarter tone bends that just add enough expression to make me feel satisfied after a show. You know, I do feel like I'm singing. Boy, that sounds snotty, doesn't it? I'm singing through the guitar. On that note, did I answer that? Yeah, pentatonics. You know, there's so many opinions out there about how you should learn. I just say be a sponge, learn everything. And the people that you resonate with the most, your favorite artists, be like a forensic scientist and tear that apart and go, why do you like them? Is it the nuance? Is it the note choices? Is it the tone? A combination of everything? One thing I always tell people, there's an app that I want to marry, and it's called Transcribe. And if you're not familiar with it, it's an app that I never try to learn any new songs without it. It's a slow downer, but it's so much more. You can get it for Windows or Apple or Linux. You can put it in karaoke mode, and what it does is take the center track out of phase in a stereo mix, and you pretty much remove the vocal. And I will do that if I'm learning a cover song that's got a vocal on it. And I will also hit, there's a preset to remove the bass frequencies, and you kick that in and you see this graphic EQ, and all the bass frequencies drop to the bottom. And when you do that and slow it down, you still have the drums, you have the guitar frequencies, and if there's keyboard, you're going to have guitar or keyboard frequencies also. But this app is as close as you can get to actually having the original master tracks of a song. And I'm a stickler for accuracy. It drives me absolutely insane if I go to rehearsal and hear somebody's got the chord wrong, or if we're supposed to play a unison line together, somebody's got the notes wrong. And I will put money down and go, that's not it. Because I put that much effort into it to really get it right. I think it's important. Yeah, and partly, I used to do gigs. I had an Italian manager, and I would fly over to Europe and send the tunes in advance. And we would rehearse for 4 hours, and then we were on tour that night for the next couple weeks. And if people don't do their homework and don't get it right, it's just such a time waster. And one of the things, now this is a great use of it. I did a tour of America that I went to almost every Sam Ash store and did a clinic there and some colleges and stuff. And one of the sponsors was Fishman with their triple play wireless MIDI system. So I organized this show, and one of the things I wanted to demo, and I went with a buddy of mine that was guitar players. We played together. And one of the things I wanted to demo was all the horn patches in the synthesizer. And so I had James Brown, Earth, Wind and Fire, Chicago, and we did a medley of all these songs. And I never even spoke to my partner about it. What I did is made him get transcribed, and I had everything mapped out, which you can do there. You can make marks for verse, chorus, solo, any loop. You click and drag and make a loop. You can store all your loops. So you go, what is the difference between the first verse and the last verse? You don't have to scroll through the whole song. You just go, boom, first verse, boom, last verse, and go back and forth. Especially for a vocalist that you want to hear the nuance between the first and last verse of a vocal song. But you're able to put essentially sticky notes in there too. So I made him yellow, I was green. This trumpet part's coming up, and that's green, and you play that. And so I just sent him the notes and never said a word to him. I flew him in, we ran it down a couple times and went on the road. So it's an amazing time saver. Also, if you work for a vocalist, especially vocalists that are not that experienced, which I found, I immediately think back to the School of Rock once a year has a festival in America, and the best bands from all around the world come and play. There's some amazing kids, amazing players that are really, really good. But consistently, I found a lot of the vocalists would be singing out of their range. So maybe if a female is singing a song that was originally done by a male vocalist, they're really struggling, and vice versa. What transcribe can do, you can pitch it by half steps, up or down. And if you pitch like 5, 6, 7 half steps higher, it's going to sound a little bit like Mickey Mouse. But a vocalist can experiment singing in different keys to see what fits their voice the best, export the song in that key to the rest of the band, and instead of wasting time at rehearsal trying out different keys and aggravating the guitar player that wants to use all open strings always, you go, this is your homework. It's right here. You don't have to like guess how many half steps, because you will learn it in this new key. So I can't say enough about that. And it's also got a speed trainer that's more patient than any human on earth, where you could take a segment of a song and the default is 50% speed. There's a slider. You can do any percentage speed between 0 and 100. But for instance, you want to learn 4 bars of a really fast guitar line or something, and it'll start at 50% speed, and it'll say, how many times do you want it to repeat the loop at this speed before it goes up? And when it goes up, do you want it to speed up 1%, 5%, whatever? I always leave it at the default. Sometimes sometimes I have to take it down to maybe 30% speed if it's really a difficult piece, and then let it go a percent more every time it loops. And it's amazing because you don't really feel the loop speeding up until you get the top of your chops. Which brings me to learning science, which I think is really important. It's so important when you're learning songs, and guitar players are notorious for trying to play everything at speed immediately, and you got your Starbucks VIP thing, you're super jacked up, and it's like, and I know that feeling, I want to know it all right now. But I also know that when you play something too fast and you make a mistake, when you're learning something, your brain basically is putting 2 folders together. You think of your brain as a computer that you're putting code into it. So when you play it correctly, you have a folder here. You might get it right 75% of the time and maybe make a mistake 25% of the time. Now you have 2 folders. You have plan A, plan B. So when you go on stage and you might be a little more uptight, might be a little nervous because of the audience, like your mother's watching you in the audience, and it kind of attacks your brain a little bit. Your brain doesn't care what folder it pulls from. How about the 25%? We haven't done that in a while. So having said that, it's super, super important to play really slowly and really accurately, consistently. And I'm guilty of always pushing it. I think I got it now. I'll push it a little bit. If I make a mistake, I know what's happening, and I don't want it to get a deep ditch routing in my brain of the wrong note. So I'll back down and do it slow. It's super important. When you learn something new, there's a synapse connection, a new synapse connection in the brain that happens. And you can kind of think of it as the first time you play something, it's the size of a hair. It's much smaller than that, but just an analogy. They have found that after, I think, 60 repetitions, they can actually physically see the connection bigger. So you can think of it as the size of a hair, size of a string, size of a rope, and eventually it's the size of a chain. And it's almost impossible to screw it up because it's routed in there over and over and over and over again. And the only drag with the human brain is like once you get it, if you don't play it for a year, it's not all the way gone, but you got to put a lot more effort into it. In fact, I was talking to somebody, I played with Anthony Mazzella, a great guitar player in Phoenix the other day. He did something that was reminiscent of Pink Floyd, and I was asked to play with a Pink Floyd tribute and guest on 6 songs in Italy years ago. And I thought, yeah, that sounds like fun, because you can't do Pink Floyd as a trio. You got to have the background singers, the videos, all the sounds. It's a huge production, and it just sounded like fun. And it took me so long to memorize those solos, in part because they're almost all pentatonic and they're very samey. And so I'd be playing a line when I was first getting into it, and I'd go into another line, but that was like the same lick in another song that went to that line. So it took so many repetitions to get it right. And 6 months later, they wanted me to come back and do it again. And I go, no, it took so much work. It wasn't worth the money. And the guy convinced me, you know, you've already done it. It's not going to take that much work. It honestly took 75% again as much work because it was not stored in my long-term memory. I just did it. It's like, you know, cramming for a test. Okay, the test is done. You move on to something else. And if you get tested again 6 months later, that stuff's gone. So it's really fascinating to know how the brain works. And it really changed how I learned music. Just being aware of, and before I learned this, I was one of those people that would sit there and try to learn tunes, be making mistakes and going over and over and over and over again, which brings up another point in learning science, that your brain starts to spin out after 15 or 20 minutes working on something. So if you spend an hour on it, you're really doing yourself a disservice. If you stop after 15 minutes and either get up, get a drink of water, or just change your state in some way, check Facebook, what happens in the background is it's almost like when we used to make DVDs at home. You record a DVD and then you have to hit finalize. Well, when you get away from the project is when your brain is actually finalizing. So, not that you have to get up and have a sandwich every time, but you could go from this bit of music for 15 minutes and then go to a completely different song. So your brain is over here now and still finalizing that last thing that you worked on in the background. And because of that, it's really helpful to, even if you tend to work during the day, if you can revisit what you've worked on right before you go to bed, you'll be amazed at how much more solid it is in the morning. The first book I ever wrote was transcribed solos of my first guitar teacher. The one, well, not my first guitar teacher, the guitar teacher that got me prepped to go to GIT, the jazz guy, and it was all bebop solos. And I would work till midnight, 1 in the morning on those solos every night. Every single morning, as soon as I was conscious, the very first thought was those solos were running through my brain. And I'm thinking that it's been working on that stuff all night long without the pain of me working on it consciously, you know? So check it out for yourselves. If you got a workload of stuff to work on, try that thing, doing it right before bed and see how much more solid it is in the morning, or even listening to it before you go to bed is a real valuable thing.
Jennifer, there's another question.
Sure.
Jen.
How long did it take you to learn time? What was the process and when did it click for you so you didn't have to think about it anymore? You mean good groove?
Staying in time.
Staying in time.
Yeah.
You know, to a degree, that's a process throughout life. And I think the best thing that you can do is to record yourself. And it can be horrifying. You know, you think, okay, the red light's on, you're grooving, you feel like you're grooving, and then you listen back and go, who was that? That wasn't me. And that's happened to me so many times and was so frustrating. It's not something that you can get overnight. I think the better musicians that you play with, the better your time is going to be. And certainly when I got elevated from playing with, I was playing in 5 different bands before I got the Jackson gig. And, you know, I thought my time was good. And then I'm playing with the best people on the universe. I mean, Ricky Lawson on drums, it was like one of the #1 calls for tours because super nice guy, great to get along with, and his pocket was so fantastic. In fact, he's one of these guys, he had chops, he could play jazz, he could do anything, but he's one of those guys that would fit to the situation. And when it came time for a drum solo in the show, you got 50,000 people there that are not jazz fans, and they're not going to appreciate chops all over the map. And he would just groove. You would be able to bop your head through the whole solo, which, is really important to know your audience. I will tell you, playing with those guys for a year and a half, I went back and played with one of my bands I played with before, and I thought, how come you guys suck now? Because I had improved that much. And that's one of the elusive things as a musician. It's easy to be perpetually frustrated because you want to be here. And then when you are here, you want to be here. And you don't realize the growth that is happening because it happens in small increments day after day after day. And unless you listen to a recording yourself 5, 10, 15 years ago, you don't appreciate how much you're growing. Pat Metheny said, gosh, I think he was playing with Gary Burton when he was 17. And his number one philosophy was play with musicians that are better than you. And you can only grow if they will tolerate where you're at, that's key. And also nowadays, since the 80s, really, playing with drum machines, those don't lie. And still, I struggle when I'm doing recording. You can see the waveforms, and I'm really sensitive to hearing when my stuff is off, and I'll either re-record it or bump it up. But you can see the waveform of the drum or the snare, and see that you're just a little bit off. I might cut it and bump it, and you just learn after a while what feels good and what doesn't feel good. Some drummers are going to rush, some are going to drag, and you kind of gotta go with what you have there, but striving to stay with the click. I'll tell you, I did a session. Oh my God, this was a lesson and a half. There was a woman in Sweden who wanted me to record her whole record, and she went in and sang and played guitar live. And then the drummer had to come in, and then the bass player, and I was last, and the time was just awful. I just felt so bad for the drummer. Parts of the song would kind of swing, and they'd be kind of all over the map. But in the beginning, you don't know. I remember it being a mystery. Why, starting a cover band for the first time, where I'd be playing with the track, playing like 40, 50, 1,000 times, and then I get to rehearsal and it doesn't feel the same. Well, it's because the musicians I was playing with were at my level, which was really beginner for live performance. And you hopefully grow together. And having said that, some people just suck and won't get better. So, if you get to the point where something consistently bothers you, maybe it's time to jump into a new band or get a new drummer or a new bass player or something, because everybody needs to be growing at some level. Let's see if there's other questions I didn't get on this. Let's see. My biggest influence, Jeff Beck, definitely.
I'm sorry, Jen. It looks like
Yeah.
Ben had a question. You just have to unmute yourself, Ben.
How do you know when you're done for the day when you're practicing?
You know what? I say it's going to be different for everybody. I say practice as long as you can stand without starting to hate it. Because if you're pushing yourself so hard that it gets to be a drag, then you're not going to keep it up. And that might be 3 hours for one person and 8 hours for another. When I got out, one of the most valuable things at GIT for me is they had a discipline that Howard Roberts put together in the curriculum, which is we would have an hour class in the morning, and that was followed by a 90-minute lab period to get down what we had just learned. And in the lab period, we had a sheet that said, spend 5 minutes on this G7 arpeggio in this position, 2 minutes on this. We had, it was before digital, so we had egg timers that would go off. And what that did was it would force you to focus, because if you needed 7 times on that arpeggio, or 7 minutes, then you'd get behind and behind and behind on all the other stuff. And so when school was over, I didn't do the 5-minute, 10-minute thing. I would do an hour. I would have an egg timer. I'd do an hour of sight reading, an hour of ear training, an hour of reading, an hour of arpeggios, an hour of scale patterns, and an hour of jamming. And as time went on, the improv for me is why I did all that other stuff, because that's the fun. That's when you can create on the fly. And so I would start to reset that timer for another hour and maybe just a third hour of jamming, you know. And there was a time I was disciplined enough to do 8, 9 hours a day. And I was lucky enough that I didn't have to have a day job for a little while. And then I started teaching and things morphed and start playing live in a band. So my focus was on learning tunes. And now that discipline's out the window. It's pretty much what I work on is what's in front of me, the work that's in front of me. If I have a record I need to do, if they want a solo, I might spend a couple days just jamming on it and getting a feel for it before I start recording. And now that I have all these Michael Jackson tributes, it's such a pain in the butt because they all sing in different keys and they've cut the songs into different forms. And I have to do a gig on the 12th. Usually I sit in as a special guest, but this one I'm going to be doing the whole show. And I haven't played a lot of those songs in many years. And so I didn't even want to try to start, the next tribute because I don't want to scramble my brain. I want to get these forms and these keys nailed properly. And then I'll start on the next tribute. And I'm going to have to brush up every tribute I do so I don't confuse forms and stuff. Let's see.
We're actually coming up on we're at the hour.
Okay. Just a couple more. I promise I won't motor mouth. What would you do differently if you, as a young guitarist music student starting out? I don't know that I would have done anything different, but I think one thing in hindsight is not to stress so much about my career. I took it so seriously, like if my first record doesn't become a hit, my career's over and blah, 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 blah. And you always have to come back to, why are you playing music? It's to get better. I mean, the top satisfaction is to know that you're getting better. And even now, after all these years of playing, I'll start to see things differently on the guitar and I go, wow, it could have had a V8. Why didn't I see that before? And just always improving and being able to express better and more consistently is key there. And let's see, you've done some amazing shows. What was the favorite? With Michael Jackson, we did a gig south of LA in a place called Irvine that was a grassy meadow, and for some reason the sound was supreme. In most of the stadiums, the sound just goes out, and you get the sound from the monitors, but it's not a lush CD quality sound, and that was the top gig with him. And with Jeff, it's kind of funny because he had a reputation of being seriously moody when he was younger. Unfortunately, I didn't meet him until he was well into his 50s, where he kind of calmed down a little bit. But for some reason, there was a gig in Sicily that was just so ideal. One of those pinch yourself moments where you go, oh, this is where my career brought me to this moment. It was on a beach in Italy, summer night, just gorgeous. We had a wonderful pasta before. He was in a shit mood for some reason, but it couldn't daunt me because I was having such a great time. I'm playing with Jeff Beck in Italy and Sicily, and there's this incredible environment. It was worth all those thousands of hours of working on scales, So, any last minute things?
I mean, what I heard is practice 3 to 8 hours a day. Sure.
Well, whatever you can stand and still enjoy it. That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
Absolutely. It was just one last thing. There was one favorite story that you had told about you were working on the Beat It solo in one studio, and you want to continue?
Yeah, well, I was in a cover band when Beat It came out, and I remember we were plugging in our gear while the radio was on before we started to rehearse, and Beat It came on, and we were listening, but when Eddie's solo came on, we all just stopped and looked at each other like, this is not your average top 40 solo. This is so far beyond. The bass player thought it was Alan Holdsworth, and I was stunned, and I got to learn this. It's just too good. And I went home, and at that time it was all cassettes, pre-digital, and I took the solo, and I didn't understand all the techniques he was using. He did serious dive bombs and tapping harmonics and tapping and all that. Although I was into tapping, I could understand that, but basically the solo kicked my butt. And to slow it down, I had a Marantz cassette deck that you could slow down the motor, but it was analog, so it also changed the pitch. So I kind of had to translate if I was between an octave below and an octave up. I probably took it down a full octave so it would be the same note names anyway. And I gave up 3 times on it before I finally got it. So persistence pays off. It bought me a house, basically, is what I'm saying here.
And no, I mean, there was the point in time when he was, I guess, in the next studio or something like that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we were on a break in the tour, and there was a gig that had been booked with one of my old bands, and then they wanted me on it. And all of my guitars were in road cases, ready to go to the next destination with Michael Jackson. All I had was a Steinberger guitar that had a crap tremolo and headless guitar. It was kind of whack. And it was one of those LA days that was just, traffic was hell, and it was hot, and I showed up late. And the band manager ran out to my car and said, "Eddie Van Halen's next door. He wants you to prove you can play the Beat It solo." And that energy just came to me like overload. And I go, "No." And eventually they came to our place we were rehearsing and said, "Well, would you just go and say hi to him?" And I said, "Of course." So as soon as I walked over, he put his 5150 guitar on me, which anytime I play a guy's guitar, it hangs down to my knees, and I tend to have my guitar up kind of high. So that was a little awkward. Plus, I've been using the Floyd Rose tremolo for just a couple years after it was invented. I've been using it ever since. And I have mine where it stays put, where I can move it and it stays in that position. His was loose, so it would swing. So anytime I had to go grab it, it was like I had to go find it. But he wanted me to play the Beat It solo, so I did. And then he took the guitar and he was trying to remember it. So he basically wanted me to show him his own solo. But he picked it up pretty quick, and it was actually really fascinating. I would have given anything to have a smartphone camera and video it, because he played some of the same notes I was playing, but in a different way. And that's one of the mystifying things about guitar, is just because you hear a note doesn't mean it's in that position on that string. And usually if something's really difficult, you're probably playing it in the wrong position. Or sometimes I'll find something that I just go, it can't be that hard. Well, the original was an open tuning, and Van Halen did that sometimes too. And that's where YouTube can come in handy, because somebody else has figured it out. And I go, you change the tuning and it's super easy. So the resources the kids have today are pretty phenomenal.
Wish I had them. I've been picking up that little LP needle every once in a while.
Oh, I drove my sister to drink using that.
Oh yeah, scratch the record, put the penny on it. Yeah, those were the days.
No, they weren't. But we didn't know any better. There was nothing to compare it to.
Any last questions for Jennifer? Oh, it's been awesome. Absolutely appreciate you taking the time, and
Sure. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
yeah,
And I'll send you the link to my record so you can pass it out to people.
absolutely. So awesome, everybody. Again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Okay, good to meet you all.
And yeah, we'll be in touch for sure. And yeah, hopefully set up something else in the future.
Okay, sounds good. Enjoy your weekend.
Absolutely, you too. Thank you
Okay.
again.
All right, bye.